Christianity under Constantine in the early 4th century CE, that institutional backing accelerated spread dramatically. But for Unit 2 specifically, you want to focus on Christianity's spread along trade routes beyond Rome. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the world's oldest Christian institutions, was established in the 4th century partly through Red Sea trade connections. The Nestorian Christians, a branch that College Board sometimes references, spread east along the Silk Roads all the way into Tang Dynasty China. The famous Nestorian stele, a stone monument erected in Chang'an in 781 CE, is direct evidence of Christianity appearing in East Asia via trade routes. If you see a primary source referencing this stele on an exam, connect it immediately to Silk Road exchange and religious diffusion. The exam traps you need to avoid. The single most common mistake students make is treating the spread of religion as a one-way process of conquest or force. The AP exam is almost always looking for you to credit voluntary conversion, merchant activity, missionary work, and cultural syncretism as the primary mechanisms. A second trap is failing to connect religious spread to specific trade networks. Always anchor your answer in the Silk Roads, Indian Ocean Network, or Trans-Saharan routes, because that grounds your response in Unit 2's framework and earns rubric points. For FRQs, the College Board rubric rewards specific evidence, so don't just say merchants spread Islam. Say Arab and Persian merchants sailing the Indian Ocean established communities along the Swahili coast, bringing Islam to Kilwa and Mombasa. That specificity is the difference between a 3 and a 5. Connections across units. This topic threads beautifully through the entire course. In Unit 1, you see the classical foundations of these faiths. In Unit 3, you'll return to the Mongol Empire and how Pax Mongolica re-energized Silk Road exchange, and with it, another wave of religious movement. In Unit 4, European maritime expansion creates new vectors for Christian missionary activity. Every time you see a trade network in this course, ask yourself what religions are traveling alongside the goods. With religion now firmly on your mental map of exchange networks, let's turn to another invisible cargo that traveled the same routes, the ideas, technologies, and diseases that transformed every civilization they touched. 2.5b. Transfer of art, language, and technology across networks. Let's talk about one of the most fascinating phenomena in all of human history, the way ideas, inventions, and artistic styles refuse to stay put. Think about the last time you heard a word in English that sounded suspiciously French, or noticed that a Buddhist temple in Japan looks remarkably similar to one in India, or realized that the paper you're taking notes on was invented in China over 1,000 years ago. That's cultural diffusion in action. And for the AP exam, understanding exactly how and why these transfers happened across the medieval trade networks is absolutely essential. What the College Board wants you to understand. The College Board frames this topic around a deceptively simple idea. Trade routes did not just move goods, they moved culture. The Silk Roads, Indian Ocean networks, Trans-Saharan roads, and the emerging connections across the Americas all served as highways for artistic traditions, spoken and written languages, and technological innovations. Your job on the exam is to identify specific examples of these transfers, explain the mechanisms that enabled them, and analyze the consequences for both the sending and receiving societies. That last part, consequences, is where most students leave points on the table. Technology transfer, the big 3. When the AP exam asks about technology transfer, 3 examples appear more consistently than almost any others, and you need to know each one cold. Paper invented in Han Dynasty China traveled west along the Silk Roads, reaching the Islamic world by the 8th century and eventually transforming European intellectual life. Gunpowder followed a similar path. Developed in Tang Dynasty China, it spread westward and was adapted by Islamic and later European states into increasingly devastating military applications. Then there's the magnetic compass, another Chinese invention that made its way into Arab and European maritime culture and directly enabled the age of exploration you'll study in Unit 4. Notice the pattern: Chinese innovations, westward transmission, transformative effects. That's a reliable AP exam framework. Here's the edge case that trips up students on multiple choice questions. Transfer is not always one-directional. While China was exporting paper and gunpowder westward, ideas about mathematics, including the Arabic numerals that are themselves adapted from Indian mathematical traditions, were moving eastward and into Europe. The Islamic world in particular acted as an incredible relay station, preserving Greek philosophical and scientific texts, developing algebra and trigonometry, and then transmitting all of it into medieval Europe. When you see a question asking about the role of the Islamic world in knowledge transfer, think preserver, adopter, and transmitter. That three-part role is a go-to FRQ point. Artistic exchange, more than just pretty pictures. Artistic transfer is a subtler concept, but the AP exam tests it with surprising regularity. The key thing to understand is that when artistic styles travel, they almost always blend with local traditions rather than replacing them. The College Board calls this syncretism, and it's one of the most important vocabulary words in all of Unit 2. Think of Buddhist art as it moved from South Asia along the Silk Roads into Central Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. The serene, idealized facial features of the Buddha shifted to reflect local aesthetics at every stop. By the time you see a Japanese Buddhist statue, you're looking at something that carries the spiritual DNA of India but has been transformed through Chinese and Korean hands into something distinctly Japanese, that is syncretism in its purest form. A common wrong answer trap on the MCQ section is to assume that cultural transfer means cultural replacement. If a question shows you a piece of art that blends two traditions and asks what it demonstrates, the answer is almost never one culture completely adopting another. Look for answer choices that use language like blend, synthesis, or adaptation. That's your signal. Language and writing systems. Language transfer is closely tied to religious and commercial expansion, and this connection is crucial for your exam. Arabic spread as a sacred language of Islam along trade routes and through conquest, becoming a lingua franca, a common language across diverse cultures, from Spain to Southeast Asia. This matters because when Arabic spread, so did Islamic art, legal traditions, and scholarship. Language was the vehicle. Everything else was the cargo. Similarly, Sanskrit spread through Hindu and Buddhist missionaries across South and Southeast Asia, giving rise to new writing systems in places like Thailand, Cambodia, and Indonesia that still bear Sanskrit roots today. When you see Angkor Wat on the AP exam, remember that this Khmer monument in Cambodia is a testament to Indian cultural influence transmitted through religious networks, not trade goods, but ideas and sacred language. The AP exam also loves to test you on Chinese characters as a shared writing system across East Asia. Japan, Korea, and Vietnam all adapted Chinese characters for their own languages, which is one reason East Asian intellectual and administrative culture remained interconnected for centuries. Think of it like a shared operating system running very different software. Connecting to other units. Don't miss this. This topic is a bridge that connects Unit 2 to almost everything else in the course, and recognizing those connections is the difference between a 4 and a 5. In Unit 1, you learned about the classical empires, Rome, Han China, Gupta India, that built the infrastructure these exchange networks ran through. The decline of those empires in Unit 1 actually redirected cultural transmission rather than ending it, something the exam loves to probe. In Unit 3, the spread of Islam accelerates many of these same transfer patterns. In Unit 4, the technologies transferred along medieval routes, especially the compass and gunpowder, directly enable European maritime expansion. And in Unit 6, industrialization depends on scientific knowledge that itself accumulated through centuries of cross-cultural intellectual exchange. The FRQ scoring reminder. When you're writing about cultural transfer in a document-based question or long essay, remember that the College Board's rubric rewards complexity. Don't just say, the Silk Roads spread Buddhism. Say who adopted it, what changed in the process, what the consequences were for political or social structures, and whether there was any tension or resistance. Noting that cultural transfer was sometimes contested, that local elites resisted foreign ideas, or that syncretism created hybrid identities that pleased nobody entirely, is exactly the kind of sophisticated argument that earns the complexity point. The deeper truth of this whole topic is that human cultures have always been leaky, borrowing and stealing and reinventing across every boundary that politics tries to draw, and the networks of Unit 2 were the channels through which that beautiful, messy exchange happened at a global scale. With all of that in mind, let's move forward and look at how these same networks shaped the spread of religion, because faith, it turns out, was one of the most powerful passengers those trade routes ever carried. 2.6 Environmental Consequences of Connectivity. The world as an unintentional science experiment. Here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine you're moving into a new apartment and you bring your houseplants with you. Those plants carry soil, and that soil carries seeds, insects, maybe even fungal spores. Within a year, your neighbor's garden looks completely different, and not because they planned it that way. Now scale that up to entire continents, trade caravans crossing the Silk Roads, ships full of goods crossing the Indian Ocean, and you start to understand what historians mean by the environmental consequences of connectivity. The very networks of exchange that made Unit 2 so transformative weren't just moving silk and spices, they were accidentally and sometimes deliberately rewiring the ecosystems of the entire planet. The Columbian Exchange and its ecological logic. The single most important concept in this section is the Columbian Exchange, and the College Board expects you to understand it at multiple levels, not just what it was, but how it worked, and why it matters across different time periods and regions. The Columbian Exchange refers to the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Eastern and Western hemispheres following 1492, initiated by Spanish contact with the Americas. The key word the AP exam loves is bidirectional. This was not a one-way transfer. Things moved in both directions across the Atlantic. Think of it like two people shaking hands for the first time. Each person brings germs the other has never encountered. The hemisphere that had been more isolated, the Americas, had far less immunity built up, which is precisely why disease moved with such devastating asymmetry. From Europe and Africa to the Americas, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and other diseases that killed somewhere between 50 and 90% of indigenous populations in the decades following contact. That demographic collapse is one of the most significant environmental events in world history, because when millions of people stop farming land, that land reverts, forests regrow, wildlife returns, and the landscape itself transforms. Some historians argue this reforestation actually contributed to a cooling of global temperatures in the 1600s, sometimes called a Little Ice Age. That's how tightly human activity and environment are connected. Going the other direction from the Americas to the rest of the world came crops that would reshape agricultural systems on every inhabited continent. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cassava, cacao, tobacco, and sweet potatoes moved eastward and transformed what people ate, how many people could be fed, and therefore how populations grew. The Irish potato famine in the 1840s, centuries later, is actually a consequence of the Columbian Exchange. Ireland had become so dependent on an Andean crop that when a fungal blight hit, catastrophe followed. The AP exam may ask you to trace long-term consequences like this, so always think in terms of ripple effects. Diseases as historical agents. The College Board wants you to treat disease not as background noise, but as an active historical force. When you see an AP question about population decline in the Americas, the primary cause is epidemic disease, not warfare or enslavement alone, though those compound the damage. This is a classic MCQ trap. Students often attribute indigenous population collapse mainly to conquest and forced labor. While those were real and horrific, disease was the overwhelming driver. Keep that hierarchy clear in your head. Similarly, don't confuse the direction of disease transfer. The exam occasionally tries to trick you by implying that diseases moved equally in both directions. They did not. The Americas sent back very few diseases to the Old World. Syphilis is the most debated example, and historians still argue about its origins, so the AP exam tends to avoid that minefield. What you need to know is that the massive, civilization-altering disease transfer ran from the Old World to the New. The Silk Roads and environmental change. The Columbian Exchange gets most of the attention, but the AP exam also expects you to understand that earlier networks, particularly the Silk Roads, had their own environmental consequences. The Black Death, or bubonic plague, spread along trade routes from Central Asia into the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe in the 1/340s. The Yersinia pestis bacterium traveled with fleas on rats that hitched rides on merchant caravans and ships. This is a perfect example of connectivity having catastrophic, unintended environmental consequences. Nobody was trying to spread plague. The very infrastructure that made commerce possible also made pandemic possible. The AP exam will sometimes ask you to compare the spread of the Black Death along the Silk Roads with the spread of disease in the Americas. Both involve pathogens traveling along networks of exchange, but the College Board will expect you to distinguish the mechanisms. Overland caravan and maritime trade routes in the Old World versus transoceanic contact in the New. The geographic scale and speed differ, but the underlying logic, connectivity, accelerates disease spread, is the same. Deforestation, agriculture, and ecological disruption. Beyond disease, the AP exam also addresses how intensified agriculture and settlement patterns transformed landscapes. As trade networks expanded demand for goods, agricultural land was cleared, forests were felled, and ecosystems were simplified to maximize output. In China, the expansion of rice cultivation and iron production during the Song dynasty led to significant deforestation in southern China. In the Mediterranean, centuries of agriculture and shipbuilding had already stripped hillsides bare, a process that accelerated as trade networks demanded more timber for ships crossing the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean Sea. A useful frame here is the idea of ecological simplification. When humans convert diverse ecosystems into monocultures or pastureland, they reduce biodiversity and increase vulnerability to disease and crop failure. This connects back to the Columbian Exchange argument. The Irish potato monoculture was ecologically fragile in exactly this way. Connecting to other units. This topic threads directly into Unit 4, where the Columbian Exchange accelerates dramatically in the 1500s and 1600s. It also connects forward to Unit 6 and 7's discussions of industrialization and environmental transformation. The AP exam loves to ask synthesis questions that span multiple units. So remember, the environmental logic you're learning here, that connectivity reshapes ecosystems, spreads disease, and alters landscapes, is a through line that runs all the way to the 20th century. The most important FRQ scoring move for this section is demonstrating causality with specificity. Don't just say trade spread disease, say which disease, which network, which population, and what the demographic consequence was. Rubric points reward precision, and precision here means naming the Columbian Exchange, identifying specific crops or pathogens, and explaining the mechanism, not just the outcome, with a solid understanding of the environmental consequences of expanding networks. You're now ready to zoom out and examine how all these threads, goods, ideas, peoples, and pathogens, shape the broader patterns of cultural and demographic change that defined the post-classical and early modern worlds. 2.6a Spread of disease along trade routes, e.g., the Black Death. The world as a network, and why that's dangerous. Here's an analogy that should feel immediately familiar to you. Think about how quickly a meme spreads across social media. One person posts something in Seoul, and within hours, people in Sao Paulo and Stockholm are sharing it. Now replace meme with pathogen, replace internet with the Silk Road and Indian Ocean trade networks, and you have the essential story of disease transmission in the medieval world. Trade routes were the internet of their day, incredibly efficient at moving goods, ideas, and unfortunately, deadly microorganisms. That's the core insight for this entire section. The AP exam wants you to understand that the expansion of trade networks between roughly 1200 and 1450 CE didn't just create economic prosperity, it created biological vulnerability on a scale humanity had never before experienced. When you connect previously isolated populations, people who have no immune experience with each other's diseases, you create the conditions for catastrophic epidemics. Keep that cause and effect relationship locked in your mind, because it appears on the exam in multiple forms. The Black Death, Anatomy of a Pandemic. The Black Death is your primary case study here, and you need to know it with some precision. The disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which traveled in the bodies of fleas living on black rats. Those rats were excellent stowaways on merchant ships and caravans, the same vessels carrying silk, spices, and porcelain across Eurasia. The plague originated in Central Asia, likely in the region around modern-day Kyrgyzstan, and spread outward along the Mongol-protected trade routes of the Pax Mongolica in the mid-14th century. Here's where the geography becomes essential for the exam. The Black Death moved in a traceable pattern that mirrors the trade network itself. It spread westward through the Mongol Empire, reaching the Black Sea port of Kaffa in modern Crimea around 1346. From there, Genoese merchant ships carried infected rats and infected people into the Mediterranean, hitting Constantinople, Sicily, and North Africa by 1347, then racing through Western Europe by 1341, 1348, 1351. Simultaneously, it moved east and south into the Middle East, Persia, Egypt, and North Africa. The plague followed the money, quite literally. If you can picture the major Silk Road and Indian Ocean trade routes on a map, you can essentially predict where the plague hit hardest and in what order. The mortality numbers you need to know: Europe lost an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of its population. Some regions lost even more. The global death toll is estimated at 75 to 200 million people across Eurasia and North Africa. These are numbers you should be ready to reference in an FRQ. College Board specifically rewards responses that include accurate magnitude claims, not just vague references to lots of people dying. Consequences that ripple across the course. This is where students often lose FRQ points. They describe the Black Death, but fail to explain its consequences with enough specificity. The plague didn't just kill people, it restructured society. In Europe, the sudden labor shortage gave surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power. Feudal lords who had once controlled peasant labor through coercion now had to compete for it. This is a direct cause of the decline of feudalism in Western Europe, a connection that bridges neatly into discussions of labor systems in Unit 3 and Unit 4. When you see an FRQ asking about changes in labor systems, the Black Death is frequently a valid piece of evidence. In the Islamic world, the plague devastated Egypt and the Mamluk Sultanate, disrupting the lucrative spice trade that ran through the Red Sea. This opened opportunities for Portuguese maritime explorers in the following century, another connection that points forward into Unit 4's age of exploration. The Mongol Empire, already overstretched, suffered severe population losses that accelerated its fragmentation. So the same disease that undermined feudalism in Europe also helped unravel the Pax Mongolica in Central Asia. Trade networks created the disaster, and then the disaster dismantled the network. MCQ traps and how to dodge them. The most common trap on multiple-choice questions about this topic is the temptation to see the Black Death as primarily a European story. College Board is very intentional about testing whether you understand this as a global phenomenon, following global trade routes. If an answer choice frames the plague as something that happened in Europe and then spread elsewhere, that framing is almost certainly wrong. The plague radiated outward from Central Asia simultaneously in multiple directions. A second trap involves causation. The exam will sometimes offer answer choices suggesting that the Mongol Empire caused the Black Death through deliberate biological warfare. There is a famous story about Mongol forces catapulting plague-infected corpses over the walls of Kaffa in 1346, which may have contributed to early spread, but this is a minor footnote. The primary mechanism of transmission was commercial trade, not military action. Don't let a vivid anecdote replace the bigger structural explanation. A third trap is confusing the immediate cause, flea-borne bacteria, with the enabling condition, trade network, connectivity. The AP exam almost always wants you to emphasize the structural and historical conditions, the trade networks, the Pax Mongolica, the movement of merchants, rather than the biological mechanics. When in doubt, zoom out to the historical context. Connections to the broader unit. Within Unit 2, this topic connects directly to 2.1 through 2.4, where you learned how the Silk Roads, Indian Ocean networks, and the Mongol Empire created unprecedented connectivity across Eurasia. The lesson of 2.6a is essentially the dark underside of everything those sections celebrated. Connectivity is powerful and productive, but it is also a vector for shared vulnerability. This is a theme College Board returns to repeatedly in Unit 4 with the Columbian Exchange and the devastating spread of smallpox to the Americas, and even implicitly in modern discussions of globalization. When you write about the Black Death in an FRQ, your strongest responses will acknowledge both dimensions. The trade networks enabled the spread, and the spread then reshaped those same networks and the societies built around them. That bidirectional relationship between exchange and consequence is exactly what AP World History is designed to help you see. Now that you understand how disease moved as an invisible passenger through the world's great trade networks, let's turn to another form of long-distance transmission. The spread of ideas, religions, and cultural practices, because the same routes that carried plague also carried Buddhism, Islam, and the innovations that would transform medieval societies. 2.6b. Diffusion of crops and agricultural practices across trade networks. All right, let's talk about one of the most underrated but absolutely essential topics for your AP World History exam. The way crops and farming techniques hitched a ride along trade routes and fundamentally transformed human civilization. Think of it this way. The next time you bite into a tomato on your sandwich, you're experiencing the tail end of a centuries-long journey that reshaped entire economies, populations, and power structures. That's exactly the kind of thinking the College Board wants you to demonstrate on exam day. The core argument, agriculture as a driver of change. The central idea College Board is testing here is deceptively simple. Trade networks didn't just move luxury goods like silk and spices, they moved seeds, animals, farming techniques, and the agricultural knowledge that went with them, and when those things moved, populations grew, diets changed, labor systems shifted, and civilizations were transformed. Your job on the exam is to connect what moved, where it moved, and what happened as a result. All three legs of that stool need to be present in any solid FRQ response. The Indian Ocean and Silk Road networks, the great agricultural highways. The Indian Ocean Trade Network and the Silk Roads are your two primary contexts for this topic during the period 1114-50 CE. Let's start with the Indian Ocean, because it's where some of the most consequential crop diffusion happened. Imagine you're a merchant in medieval East Africa. Ships from the Arabian Peninsula, India, and Southeast Asia are pulling into your harbor regularly. What comes off those ships isn't just finished goods, it's bananas from Southeast Asia, citrus fruits, cotton, and sugarcane originating from South Asia. These crops spread westward into East Africa and eventually into the Mediterranean world, and they brought something just as important as the plants themselves, the agricultural knowledge to grow them. This is a key distinction to nail for the exam. It's not just biological diffusion of plants, it's the transfer of practices including irrigation techniques, crop rotation methods, and cultivation strategies. Along the Silk Roads, similar dynamics played out. Crops like sorghum moved from sub-Saharan Africa into Eurasia rice cultivation techniques, which had already transformed China and Southeast Asia, spread further along these networks. The key analytical move here, one that earns you rubric points on the DBQ and LEQ, is explaining the mechanism of diffusion. Crops moved because merchants, pilgrims, diplomats, and migrants carried them. They moved because demand existed in new markets, and they stuck because ecological conditions in new regions were compatible enough for cultivation. The Columbian Exchange, the big one. Now, while Unit 2 focuses on the pre-1450 world, the College Board absolutely expects you to understand how this topic connects forward to Unit 4 and the Columbian Exchange after 1492. Here's where your timeline awareness matters enormously on multiple-choice questions. The Columbian Exchange represents arguably the most dramatic episode of agricultural diffusion in human history. Old World crops like wheat, rice, sugarcane, and livestock moving to the Americas, and New World crops like maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, and manioc moving to Europe, Africa, and Asia. The potato alone is a masterclass in unintended consequences. When it reached Ireland, it so efficiently fed a growing population that demographic dependence on a single crop, set the stage for catastrophe, the Great Famine. In China, the sweet potato and maize allowed agricultural expansion into previously uncultivable highland and marginal lands, contributing to a dramatic population surge during the Ming and Qing dynasties. These are exactly the kinds of effects the exam asks you to analyze. Crops don't just feed people, they reshape demographic patterns, labor systems, and political structures. Common MCQ traps, and how to avoid them. Here's where we have to be precise, because the College Board loves to test the boundaries of this topic. One of the most common traps is confusing diffusion with immediate adoption. Just because a crop arrived in a new region does not mean it was instantly or universally adopted. The exam may present scenarios where a crop is available, but local conditions, cultural preferences, or labor systems slow its integration. Read those answer choices carefully. Another trap is attributing crop diffusion to a single network when multiple networks were often responsible. Sugarcane, for instance, traveled through the Indian Ocean network, was adopted and refined by Arab agricultural innovations in the medieval Mediterranean, part of what historians call the Arab Agricultural Revolution, and then moved further into Europe and eventually the Americas. If an MCQ answer isolates one route as the only mechanism of diffusion, be skeptical. You should also avoid conflating agricultural diffusion with colonization. Before 1450, much of the crop movement we're discussing happened through commercial exchange, migration, and cultural contact, not through imperial conquest. That distinction matters for both MCQ framing and FRQ argumentation. The Arab Agricultural Revolution, a must-know case study. Speaking of the Arab Agricultural Revolution, this is a term the College Board uses, and you should too. Between roughly 700 and 1100 CE, Arab traders and scholars facilitated the spread of crops like cotton, citrus, eggplant, and hard wheat across the Islamic world, from Persia to Spain. Crucially, this diffusion was accompanied by sophisticated irrigation systems, the Qanat underground channels, for instance, and agricultural manuals that systematized farming knowledge. This is your clearest pre-1450 example of agricultural practices, not just crops, moving through trade networks, and it makes an excellent piece of evidence in an LEQ or DBQ response. Connecting to other units. This topic doesn't live in isolation. In Unit 1, you saw how settled agriculture created the foundations of early civilizations, so agricultural diffusion in Unit 2 is really the continuation of that story at a larger geographic scale. In Unit 3 and Unit 4, the intensification of agricultural systems through the Columbian exchange and plantation agriculture links directly to the rise of slavery, and forced labor crops like sugarcane created monstrous demand for enslaved workers, which reshapes your understanding of Unit 4's economic and demographic arguments. When you write FRQs, making these cross-unit connections is one of the clearest signals to readers that you're operating at the highest levels of historical thinking. FRQ scoring reminders. When you're constructing an argument about agricultural diffusion for an LEQ or DBQ, remember that the rubric rewards you for explaining causation and continuity and change over time. Don't just list crops. Explain why they spread, what conditions enabled that spread, and what consequences followed. A response that says bananas spread through the Indian Ocean trade network is incomplete. A response that says bananas spread through the Indian Ocean trade network because monsoon winds enabled regular commercial contact between East Africa and South Asia, and their adoption in East Africa contributed to population growth in coastal communities. That's the kind of claim that earns complexity points. With the agricultural revolution of the Indian Ocean world firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to zoom out even further, because next we're going to look at how the movement of people themselves, not just their crops, reshaped the civilizations of this era. 2.7. The Americas and Interregional Exchange. So here's something that might surprise you. For most of the period we're studying in Unit 2, roughly 1200 to 1450 CE, the Americas were not connected to the massive Afro-Eurasian exchange networks we've been talking about. Think about that for a moment. While the Silk Roads were humming with trade, while the Indian Ocean was carrying spices and cotton and porcelain across half the globe, The civilizations of Mesoamerica and South America were doing something genuinely remarkable, building extraordinarily sophisticated societies entirely on their own terms. That independence is the whole point of this section, and understanding why it matters is exactly what the AP exam is going to test you on. The Americas in isolation, but not in stagnation. Let's get one thing crystal clear, because this is probably the single most common misconception students bring into the exam. Isolation does not mean backwardness. The Aztec Empire, which you should also call the Mexica because that's what they called themselves, and the Inca Empire were not primitive societies waiting to be discovered. They were complex, urban, administratively sophisticated civilizations. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, sitting in the middle of a lake on artificial islands called Chinampas, had a population of perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 people by the early 1400s, larger than any European city at the time. When Spanish conquistadors first laid eyes on it, they literally didn't believe what they were seeing. One soldier wrote that it looked like something out of a dream. Keep that image in your head. This is what you're defending when you push back against isolation equals underdevelopment. The AP exam loves to test whether you understand the internal exchange networks that developed across the Americas. The Aztecs ran a tribute-based economy where conquered peoples sent goods, cacao, feathers, obsidian, cotton, to Tenochtitlan. The great market at Tlatelolco reportedly had more goods on display than any market Hernán Cortés had ever seen in Spain. That's interregional exchange. It's just happening within the Americas, rather than connecting to Asia or Africa. The Inca and a different kind of network. Move your mental map south to the Andes, and you find the Inca Empire running something even more distinctive. The Inca didn't use markets in the same way. Instead, they operated on a system historians call mita, a labor tribute system where subject peoples owed the state their work rather than goods. In exchange, the state stored food in enormous warehouses and distributed it during famines or military campaigns. Picture it like a massive insurance policy built into the government itself. The quipu, knotted strings of different colors and configurations, served as a recording device to keep track of all this. No writing system, but an extraordinarily sophisticated accounting tool. The AP exam will sometimes ask you to compare the Aztec and Inca systems, so keep this contrast sharp. Aztec tribute was goods-based. Inca tribute was labor-based. The Inca also built one of the most impressive road systems in the pre-modern world, roughly 25,000 miles of roads connecting the empire from modern-day Colombia down to Chile. Runners called chasquis carried messages along relay stations faster than almost any communication system in the world at that time. This is an internal network of exchange, political, military, and economic integration happening without any connection to Afro-Eurasia. What the Americas were missing, and why it mattered. Here's where the exam gets tricky, and here's where you need to think carefully. The Americas had developed without several things that profoundly shaped Afro-Eurasian history: large domesticated animals for agriculture and transport, iron metallurgy, most Mesoamerican and Andean metalwork was gold, silver, and copper, beautiful, but not for tools and weapons, and the wheel as a practical technology. Now students often see this on an MCQ and think the right answer is, the Americas were less advanced. That is a trap. The correct framing is that different environmental conditions led to different technological trajectories. Jared Diamond's argument about geography and resources is lurking in the background here. The AP exam won't name him, but the logic matters. The absence of domesticated animals is particularly significant, and the exam will test this. Animals like horses, cattle, and pigs in Eurasia did two things simultaneously. They provided labor and food, and they were reservoirs for diseases. Because Eurasian populations had lived alongside these animals for millennia, they had developed partial immunities to zoonotic diseases. Indigenous American populations had not. This is the crucial setup for what happens after 1492, the Columbian Exchange, which you'll encounter again in Unit 4. File this away. The disease vulnerability of the Americas is rooted in the absence of large domesticated animals, which is itself rooted in geography and ecology. The Columbian Exchange, a bridge to later units. Speaking of 1492, This section is really the foundation for one of the most important concepts in the entire AP World History course, the Columbian Exchange. Though the exchange itself falls outside our period, it begins after 1450. Understanding the pre-contact Americas is essential context. The exam will absolutely ask you to explain why the contact between hemispheres was so catastrophically one-sided in terms of disease, and the answer lives right here in 2.7. The Americas' isolation from Eurasian disease pools, a product of their geographic separation, meant populations had no immunity. When contact came, the consequences were devastating on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. For FRQ responses, if you're asked to explain the effects of the Columbian Exchange, you must root your answer in this pre-contact context. Saying, Native Americans had no immunity to European diseases is good. Saying Native Americans had no immunity because centuries of geographic isolation had prevented exposure to the zoonotic diseases common in Eurasia, where humans and large domesticated animals had coexisted for millennia. That's a rubric point. Connecting it all. One more connection worth locking in. This section sits inside Unit 2's broader theme of networks of exchange. The key contrast the exam is building toward is between the integration of Afro-Eurasia through trade, religion, and disease, and the relative isolation of the Americas during this same period. That isolation isn't a story of failure, it's a story of parallel development, of human ingenuity solving the challenges of complex society in a completely different context. And understanding that parallel track makes the collision of 1492 not just historically interesting, but historically inevitable in a sense that you can actually explain and analyze. As we move forward into Unit 3, you'll see how those internal American networks get violently disrupted, and how the crops and peoples of the Americas become woven into a truly global exchange system for the first time. 2.7a. Trade networks in the Americas, e.g., Mississippian, Aztec, Mexica, Andean, compared to Afro-Eurasian networks. Let's start with an image that might surprise you. Picture a bustling marketplace, vendors calling out to customers, exotic goods piled high on tables, merchants negotiating prices in half a dozen languages. You're probably imagining somewhere in the Middle East or along the Silk Road, right? But what if I told you that same scene was playing out in the heart of North America, in the highlands of Mexico, and along the Andes Mountains, centuries before Europeans arrived? That's exactly what this section is about, and it's one of the most underappreciated stories in all of AP World History. The big framework, what makes a trade network. Before we compare anything, you need a working definition of a trade network in AP terms. A trade network is a system of economic exchange connecting different regions through the movement of goods, people, ideas, and technologies. The College Board wants you to think about networks in terms of what moves along them, who controls them, what technologies enable them, and what political or environmental factors shape them. Every time you analyze a trade network on an FRQ or DBQ, you're answering some version of those 4 questions. Keep that framework in your back pocket. The Mississippian Exchange System. The Mississippian culture, centered around Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis, operated one of the most sophisticated trade networks in pre-Columbian North America. At its peak, around 1100 CE, Cahokia had a population rivaling London's, and goods flowed in and out of it like blood through a heart. Copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the Rocky Mountain region, all of it ended up in Cahokia's markets and ceremonial centers. This is what historians call the Mississippian Exchange System, and the AP exam wants you to recognize it as a genuine, complex network, not a primitive barter system between small villages. Here's an analogy that might help. Think of Cahokia as an ancient Chicago, a geographic hub where rivers converge and goods naturally pool before being redistributed. The Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers served as the interstate highway system of their day. That's a key concept. Geography shapes networks. The Mississippian system was river-based, which is one of its defining characteristics and a common point of comparison on the exam. The Aztec-Mexica-Pochteca system. Now let's travel south to Mesoamerica and the Aztec Empire, which the College Board also calls the Mexica Empire. use both names, you'll see both on the exam. The Aztecs built one of the most formalized trade systems in the ancient Americas, and the word you absolutely must know is Pochteca. The Pochteca were a specialized class of long-distance merchants who operated almost like a guild. They had their own patron deity, their own courts, their own neighborhoods in Tenochtitlan, and they traveled vast distances to acquire luxury goods, jade, quetzal feathers, cacao, obsidian, that sustained both elite consumption and the tribute economy. Here's where it gets interesting for comparison purposes. The Pochteca weren't just traders, they were also spies and diplomats. They gathered intelligence about distant regions and sometimes preceded military conquest. Sound familiar? That's not unlike how Venetian or Arab merchants in the Afro-Eurasian networks sometimes served political and diplomatic functions beyond pure commerce. That parallel is exactly the kind of comparison an FRQ might ask you to make. Tenochtitlan's great market at Tlatelolco was reportedly the largest marketplace in the world when Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1519. Hernán Cortés's chronicler Bernal Diaz described it in awe, saying it was larger and better organized than any market in Spain. The exam occasionally references this primary source perspective, so file that away. Andean networks, the llama factor. Moving to South America, the Andean trade networks centered on the Inca Empire present a fascinating twist. Here's where you encounter what might be the most important edge case concept in this section. The Inca did not have markets in the conventional sense. Instead, their economy was organized around a system of labor taxation called mita and redistribution controlled by the state. Goods moved, but not through a marketplace mechanism. They moved through imperial infrastructure, stored in vast storehouses called colcas, and redistributed to workers, soldiers, and subject populations. The technology that made Andean trade possible was the llama. Unlike Afro-Eurasian networks that relied on horses, camels, and wheeled carts, Andean traders used llama caravans to move goods across the dramatic altitude changes of the Andes. This is a huge MCQ trap. Students often assume all trade networks use the same technologies. But the Americas, notably, did not have wheeled vehicles used for transport or large domesticated horses before European contact. That absence profoundly shaped the character of American trade networks and is a direct comparison point with Afro-Eurasian systems. The big comparison: Americas versus Afro-Eurasia. Now let's put it all together, because the comparison is where the AP points live. Afro-Eurasian networks, like the Silk Roads, Indian Ocean trade, and trans-Saharan routes shared certain features. They were facilitated by domesticated animals suited for long-distance travel. Camels, horses. They used coined money or standardized currency in many regions. They spread major world religions, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, alongside goods, and they connected a contiguous landmass, allowing technologies and diseases to spread rapidly across enormous distances. American networks shared some similarities: long-distance movement of luxury goods, specialized merchants, hub cities, but differed in crucial ways. First, without horses or wheeled vehicles for cargo, overland trade was slower and more limited in volume. Second, American networks generally did not use coined currency. The Aztecs used cacao beans and standardized cloth as mediums of exchange, which is functionally similar but structurally different. Third, while ideas and religions certainly spread through American networks, the absence of a shared writing system across all networks limited the diffusion of complex knowledge. And fourth, because the Americas were separated from Afro-Eurasia by oceans, the catastrophic disease exchanges that would reshape the world beginning in 1492 had not yet occurred, which connects directly to Unit 4's Columbian exchange content. Exam traps and FRQ scoring tips. The most common MCQ trap in this section is assuming American trade networks were simpler or less sophisticated than Afro-Eurasian ones. They weren't simpler, they were differently structured, adapting brilliantly to their geographic and biological environments. When you see a question that implies hierarchy between networks, be skeptical. The College Board frames this as comparison, not ranking. For FRQs, remember that a strong comparison requires both similarity and difference with specific evidence. Don't just say both had long-distance trade. Say, both the Pochteca of the Mexica Empire and Silk Road merchants transported luxury goods across vast distances, serving elite consumers and state interests. Specificity earns points. This topic connects forward to Unit 4, where the arrival of Europeans disrupts and eventually dismantles these networks, and backward to Unit 1, where you examine the civilizations that built them. Understanding these networks as living systems, not just lists of goods, will serve you well throughout the entire course. With American trade networks firmly in your toolkit, you're now ready to explore how networks of exchange transform the cultures and environments they pass through, which is exactly where we're headed next. 2.7b Relative Isolation of the Americas and Oceania from Afro-Eurasian Exchange Networks. Let's talk about what it means to be left out of the party, and why that actually matters enormously for world history. Imagine you live in a neighborhood where most of the houses are connected by a series of well-worn paths. People walk between them constantly, trading food, sharing gossip, passing along the occasional illness. Now imagine two houses on the far edges of that neighborhood, separated from the main cluster by wide fields and dense forests. The people in those houses aren't unintelligent or inactive. They're building their own communities, trading with nearby neighbors, developing rich cultures. They're just not part of the main network of paths. That, in essence, is the story of the Americas and Oceania during the period 1200 to 1450 CE. The geography that made isolation possible. The College Board wants you to understand that isolation here is relative, not absolute. This word choice is deliberate and will show up in MCQ answer choices designed to trip you up. The Americas and Oceania were not frozen in time. They were not empty. They were not static. What they lacked was consistent, sustained contact with the massive Afro-Eurasian exchange network, that enormous web of trade routes, including the Silk Roads, Indian Ocean trade, and trans-Saharan networks that connected Europe, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia. Why the separation? Geography is the primary driver. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans functioned as barriers rather than highways during this period. Unlike the Indian Ocean, which had predictable monsoon winds that sailors could harness reliably, the Pacific was genuinely vast and the Atlantic was not yet understood well enough for consistent crossing. Pre-Columbian contact across these oceans was either non-existent or so sporadic, like the Norse settlements at L'Anse aux Meadows around 1000 CE, that it didn't generate the kind of lasting, transformative exchange that defines a real network connection. When the AP exam asks about Norse contact with the Americas, remember, it happened, but it was brief, limited in scope, and left no sustained cultural or biological exchange. That's why it doesn't fundamentally change the isolation narrative. What developed in isolation? Here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating, and where the AP exam loves to probe your understanding. Relative isolation doesn't mean stagnation. It means independent development, and the Americas and Oceania produce some of the most remarkable civilizations the world has ever seen, just on their own trajectories. In Mesoamerica and the Andes, you have the Aztec or Mexica Empire in central Mexico and the Inca Empire running the length of western South America. Both developed complex political hierarchies, sophisticated agricultural systems, impressive architecture, and long-distance trade within their own regions. The Inca built the most extensive road network in the pre-Columbian Americas, thousands of miles of carefully maintained paths connecting an empire stretching from modern-day Colombia to Chile. That's not isolation from everything, it's isolation specifically from Afro-Eurasian networks. Keep that distinction sharp in your mind. Oceania tells a parallel story. The Polynesian peoples were arguably the greatest maritime navigators in human history, expanding across the Pacific to Hawaii, New Zealand, Easter Island, and beyond, using stars, ocean currents, and wave patterns to guide their voyages. They had their own inter-island exchange networks. What they lacked was connection to the vast Afro-Eurasian system. Again, relative isolation, not total. The consequences of isolation, the AP exam's favorite angle. The College Board really wants you to think analytically about what isolation produced and what it prevented, because this framing shows up constantly in both MCQs and FRQs. First, consider what was absent. The Americas and Oceania did not participate in the massive exchange of crops, animals, technologies, and diseases that characterized Afro-Eurasian networks. This is crucial. The Columbian Exchange, which you'll cover in Unit 4, is essentially the dramatic ending of this isolation and its catastrophic consequences for indigenous populations, particularly epidemic disease, are directly caused by the centuries of separation before 1492. When European pathogens arrived, indigenous peoples had no prior exposure and therefore no immunological experience with diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. That biological vulnerability is a direct consequence of the relative isolation you're studying right now. Think of it as the setup for one of history's most devastating plot twists. Second, consider the independent innovations that emerged precisely because these civilizations were developing without outside influence. The Maya developed one of only a handful of fully independent writing systems in human history. The Inca created the quipu, a complex system of knotted cords for recording information. Mesoamerican civilizations developed calendrical systems of remarkable precision without contact with Old World astronomy. These achievements demonstrate human ingenuity operating in parallel, not in deficit. MCQ traps and FRQ scoring points. The most common wrong answer trap is conflating isolated from Afro-Eurasian networks with isolated from all trade and exchange. If you see an answer choice claiming the Americas had no trade networks before 1492, that's wrong. The Aztec marketplace at Tlatelolco was one of the largest markets in the world. The Inca administered a redistribution economy across a continent-spanning empire. Regional exchange networks absolutely existed. Another common trap involves treating isolation as a moral or developmental judgment. The AP exam, and good historical thinking, never frames isolation as backwardness. If a question or answer choice implies that isolated societies were less advanced, that framing is both historically inaccurate and a College Board red flag. For FRQ responses, the scoring rubric rewards you for explaining the mechanism of isolation, geographic barriers, the consequences of isolation, independent development, biological vulnerability, absence of certain technologies like the wheel in some regions or iron metallurgy, and the connections across time periods. Specifically, you want to link this topic forward to Unit 4's Columbian Exchange and backward to Unit 2's broader discussion of how Afro-Eurasian networks functioned, because contrast is one of the most powerful analytical tools available to you. Connecting to the bigger picture. Everything in Unit 2 is essentially asking you the same underlying question. What happens when people and societies connect? And what happens when they don't? The Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean Trade Network, and the Trans-Saharan routes show you the transformative power of connection, the spread of Buddhism, Islam, crops, technologies, plague. The relative isolation of the Americas and Oceania shows you the counterfactual, what independent development looks like when those connections are absent. Hold those two images side by side, because the AP exam is constantly asking you to compare and contextualize with that foundation in place. You're ready to zoom out and look at how all of these networks and the civilizations they touched begin to shift as we move toward the era of European exploration and the dramatic end of that relative isolation. 2.8 Diffusion of technologies and ideas across trade networks. Imagine you're sitting in a coffee shop right now, holding a ceramic mug, maybe checking your phone, perhaps wearing cotton clothing. Every single one of those things, the ceramic tradition, the smartphone's microchip ancestry, the cotton textile industry, traces its origins to technologies that diffused across trade networks centuries or even millennia ago. That's exactly what this section is about. And once you internalize that framing, the AP exam questions on this topic become almost intuitive. The core concept, what diffusion actually means. The College Board uses the term diffusion very precisely. It doesn't just mean spreading. It means the process by which technologies, crops, ideas, religious beliefs, artistic styles, and disease spread from one society to another through contact, most often through trade. The key insight the AP exam tests again and again is that diffusion is almost never a simple, clean transfer. Ideas and technologies get adapted, modified, and sometimes transformed beyond recognition when they cross cultural boundaries. Keep that word adapted in your head like a mantra for this entire section. The Silk Roads, Indian Ocean Trade Network, Trans-Saharan routes, and later the Mediterranean and Atlantic systems all functioned as what historians call vectors of exchange. Think of them like highways, and the goods, people, and ideas traveling them like cars. The highway doesn't care whether it's carrying a spice merchant or a Buddhist monk, it facilitates movement for all of them. That's your mental model for how trade networks enabled diffusion. Technologies that diffused and why they matter for your score. The AP exam expects you to know specific examples of technology diffusion with enough depth to deploy them in both multiple-choice questions and free response essays. Let's walk through the most heavily tested ones. Paper and printing technologies originated in China and moved westward through Islamic intermediaries. By the time paper reached the Islamic world around the 8th and 9th centuries, Arab scholars weren't just copying the technology, they were establishing houses of wisdom like the Beit al-Hikmah in Baghdad, creating an intellectual infrastructure that then transmitted Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge to later European thinkers. When paper eventually reached medieval Europe, it helped make the later Gutenberg printing revolution possible. That's a chain of diffusion spanning roughly 800 years, and the AP exam loves to ask you to trace those chains. The magnetic compass and gunpowder are two other Chinese innovations whose diffusion changed the world in dramatically different ways. The compass, moving westward through trade, and possibly the Mongol Empire, enabled the European age of exploration in Unit 4, so right here you have a direct connection across units. Every time you write about European maritime expansion, you should be thinking back to this moment of technological diffusion. Gunpowder similarly traveled from China through the Islamic world and into Europe, where it was adapted into cannons and firearms that reshaped military power hierarchies globally. Notice the pattern: origin, transmission pathway, adaptation, consequences. That 4-part framework is your essay writing engine for any diffusion question. Agricultural crops deserve equal attention. The Columbian Exchange, covered more in Unit 4, is actually the culmination of a much longer history of crop diffusion. Along the Indian Ocean network, crops like sugar, cotton, and citrus fruits moved from South and Southeast Asia into the Middle East and East Africa, then eventually into the Mediterranean world. When you see a question about why Islamic agricultural practices in medieval Iberia or the Middle East look so different from Roman-era farming, the answer is diffusion via trade networks. Religious and intellectual diffusion, the intangible goods. Here's where many students lose points. They focus only on physical goods and technologies and forget that the AP exam treats religious ideas, philosophical systems, and artistic traditions as equally important examples of diffusion. Buddhism's spread from South Asia into Central and East Asia followed the Silk Roads almost perfectly. Merchants carried not just silk and spices, but Buddhist texts, monks, and artistic styles. Buddhist cave temples along the Silk Roads in places like Dunhuang, China, show a blending of Indian, Persian, and Chinese artistic traditions that's diffusion and adaptation made visible in stone and pigment. Islam's rapid spread in the 7th through 9th centuries followed trade routes with extraordinary fidelity. Arab merchants were operating across the Indian Ocean long before Islamic conquest extended politically, and those commercial relationships became conduits for religious conversion. Coastal East African city-states like Kilwa, Southeast Asian ports like Malacca, both converted to Islam primarily through merchant contact rather than military conquest. The AP exam will test whether you understand the mechanism of spread, not just the fact that it happened. Common MCQ traps to avoid right now. The most dangerous trap on this topic is confusing diffusion with independent invention. If an exam question asks why similar technologies appeared in different societies, one answer choice will always suggest that different peoples naturally invented similar things independently. Sometimes that's true. The wheel may have been invented independently in multiple places, but for the specific examples in this unit, paper, compass, gunpowder, crop varieties, the College Board wants you to recognize diffusion via networks as the primary explanation. Read the question carefully for phrases like most likely explains or best accounts for. A second trap involves chronology. Students frequently misplace when certain technologies arrived in certain regions. The printing press reached Europe in the mid-15th century, not the 13th. Paper reached the Islamic world before it reached Europe. That sequence matters because it explains the Islamic world's scholarly flourishing, while Europe was still in manuscript culture. If a question gives you a timeline, slow down and check it against what you know. A third subtler trap is conflating the carrier of diffusion with the origin. Arab merchants carried paper westward, but they didn't invent it. The Mongol Empire facilitated faster communication across Eurasia, but most of the technologies and ideas that moved during the Pax Mongolica originated elsewhere. Don't let the facilitator become the inventor in your answers. Connecting across units for essay power. This section connects to almost every other unit in the course. Unit 1 gives you the regional foundations before diffusion accelerated. Unit 3's Mongol Empire is perhaps the single most powerful diffusion accelerator in pre-modern history. The Pax Mongolica created safe passage across Eurasia and intensified the exchange of everything from plague, tragically, to paper money. Unit 4's European expansion is unintelligible without understanding that Europeans were accessing diffused technologies, the compass, Latin sail, astrolabe. To enter trade networks, they didn't build. Unit 5's Industrial Revolution builds on centuries of accumulated technological knowledge, much of it diffused from Asia through exactly these networks. When you write comparative or continuity and change essays, reaching back into this unit to establish the long-term roots of later developments is exactly the kind of historical thinking that earns the highest rubric scores. The FRQ scoring reminder. For document-based questions and long essay questions, the College Board rewards complexity, showing how diffusion wasn't uniform, how some regions received technologies and adapted them while others rejected or ignored them, how the same idea, say gunpowder, could produce wildly different outcomes in different societies. That kind of nuanced argument, grounded in the specific examples we've covered here, is what separates a 3 from a 5. With diffusion patterns now firmly in mind, you're perfectly set up to explore how one specific network, the Mongol Empire, turbocharged the very exchange processes you've just learned about, taking everything we've discussed and scaling it to a continental level. 2.8a Paper printing, gunpowder, and other technologies spreading along trade routes. The big picture, why technology transfer matters. Imagine you invented something brilliant in your kitchen. Let's say the perfect recipe for sourdough bread. Now imagine that recipe slowly traveling across the world, picked up by travelers, modified by local bakers, and eventually transforming the diets of people who never heard your name. That's essentially what happened with Chinese innovations during this period, and understanding how and why technology spreads is the central skill the AP exam is testing in this section. The College Board wants you to recognize that the Silk Roads, Indian Ocean trade network, and overland caravan routes weren't just moving silk and spices, they were moving ideas. Technologies developed in one region became world-changing tools in another. The exam will test whether you understand both the mechanics of diffusion and the historical consequences of specific technologies. Let's build that understanding from the ground up. The core technologies you must know. Paper is your starting point, developed in China during the Han Dynasty. Around the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, paper replaced heavier, more expensive writing materials like silk, bamboo strips, and the papyrus used across the Mediterranean and Middle East. Think of paper as the original disruptive technology. It made information storage dramatically cheaper and more portable. By the time of the Tang and Song dynasties, paper was moving west along trade routes, and by the 8th century, Muslim scholars in Baghdad were using it to fuel the intellectual explosion we call the Islamic Golden Age. The House of Wisdom in Abbasid Baghdad becomes almost unimaginable without paper. When you see an FRQ asking you to explain how trade routes facilitated cultural exchange, paper is a perfect piece of evidence because it connects Chinese innovation directly to Islamic scholarship and eventually to European intellectual life, Printing technology deepens this story considerably. Woodblock printing appeared in Tang, China, but the real breakthrough for your exam is movable type, developed by Baisheng during the Song Dynasty, around 1040 CE. Here's the analogy that sticks. Think of woodblock printing like carving an entire pizza out of one block of cheese. It works, but you have to start over every time. Movable type is like having individual toppings you can rearrange on any pizza you want. It's vastly more flexible. The critical exam connection is that Chinese movable type predates Gutenberg's printing press in Europe by about 4 centuries. The AP exam loves asking you to sequence these developments chronologically, and students frequently get tripped up by assuming Gutenberg was the inventor of printing. He wasn't. He adapted and improved upon techniques that had already traveled westward. The consequence of printing, spreading into the Islamic world and eventually Europe, was an acceleration of literacy, scholarship, and eventually religious and political upheaval. When you connect this to Unit 3 and the Protestant Reformation, you're demonstrating exactly the kind of cross-unit thinking that earns full points on the DBQ. Gunpowder is perhaps the most consequential technology in this section, and the exam will absolutely test its origins and diffusion. Developed by Chinese alchemists during the Tang Dynasty, somewhat accidentally while searching for an elixir of immortality, which is a detail worth remembering because it illustrates how innovations often emerge from unexpected contexts. Gunpowder was first used in Chinese warfare with fire arrows and early cannons. As it traveled west along trade routes into the Islamic world and then into Europe, it was adapted and refined into the firearms and artillery that would fundamentally reshape warfare and political power. This is your direct bridge into Unit 3's gunpowder empires. The Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals all built their power partly on this technology. The exam frequently asks students to trace a technology forward in time to understand its consequences. So practice drawing that line. Chinese gunpowder, Islamic adaptation, European artillery, decline of feudal castles and mounted knights, centralization of political power. Other technologies you shouldn't overlook. The exam also expects you to know about the magnetic compass, which transformed navigation and made the sustained Indian Ocean and Atlantic trade possible. Developed in China and diffused westward, the compass is a strong piece of evidence for any essay about how technological exchange enabled commercial expansion. Similarly, the stirrup, though its origins are debated, transformed cavalry warfare across Eurasia, and cast iron production techniques from China influenced metalworking globally. The broader pattern the College Board wants you to see is that no civilization was self-sufficient in innovation. Technological progress was fundamentally a networked phenomenon. Common exam traps and how to avoid them. Here's where students lose points, so pay close attention. The most common MCQ trap is assuming that technologies transferred quickly or uniformly. In reality, diffusion was slow, uneven, and often required intermediaries. The Islamic world frequently served as the crucial middleman in transferring Chinese technologies to Europe. So if an exam question asks what role Muslim merchants and scholars played in technological history, the answer isn't just they preserved Greek texts. They actively transmitted and improved Chinese innovations. A second trap is confusing origin with impact. Gunpowder originated in China, but its most dramatic political consequences emerged in Europe and the Middle East. Paper originated in China, but the Islamic Golden Age may have benefited more immediately and visibly from it than China itself did in that particular period. The exam loves asking you to separate where something came from versus where it changed history most. A third trap involves chronology. Students sometimes assume that because Europe eventually dominated global trade and technology by 1750, European innovations must have come first. This is exactly backward for this period. During the 900s through 1300s, China and the Islamic world were the global leaders in technology and scholarship. Europe was the recipient, not the source. Keeping your timeline straight is essential. Connections to other units. This section is a hub that connects outward in every direction. Looking backward to Unit 1, you can see how earlier Silk Road networks created the infrastructure that made this diffusion possible. Looking forward to Unit 3, Every gunpowder empire depends on this technological spread. In Unit 4, the printing press's eventual arrival in Europe connects directly to the scientific revolution and Reformation on the FRQ, demonstrating these connections, showing that you understand technology transfer as a continuous process across units, is what separates a score of 3 from a score of 5. A quick word on FRQ strategy. When a document-based or long essay question touches on this topic, remember that the College Board's rubric rewards complexity. Don't just list technologies, explain the mechanism of their transfer, merchants, missionaries, diplomats, conquests, and the consequences in the receiving society. Argue that technological diffusion was transformative, but also acknowledge that societies adapted technologies to local conditions rather than simply copying them wholesale. With technology transfer firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to zoom out and consider how these same trade networks facilitated not just the movement of goods and ideas, but also the spread of diseases, which, as you'll see in the next section, could be just as world-changing as any invention. 2.8b Role of diasporic merchant communities in facilitating exchange. Imagine you're a trader in 9th century Baghdad, and you need to move a shipment of Chinese silk all the way to Egypt. You don't speak Chinese. You don't speak Arabic. You don't know who to trust on a road that stretches thousands of miles through deserts, mountain passes, and open ocean. What do? You find a middleman, someone who speaks both languages, knows both cultures, has family on both ends of the route, and whose reputation is so valuable that cheating you would be social and economic suicide. That middleman is the heart of what the AP exam calls a diasporic merchant community, and understanding how these communities worked is absolutely essential for earning your What is a diasporic merchant community? The College Board uses the term diasporic merchant community very precisely, so let's lock in the definition. A diaspora refers to a group of people who have dispersed from their original homeland and settled across multiple, often distant regions while maintaining a shared cultural, ethnic, or religious identity. When merchants form these dispersed networks, they create what historians call trade diasporas, webs of trusted intermediaries who can conduct commerce across enormous cultural and geographic distances. The key word is trust. Before contracts, banks, or international law, trust, built on shared identity, kinship, and reputation, was the infrastructure of long-distance trade. Think of it like a franchise. A modern franchise works because you know exactly what you're getting at every location, even in a city you've never visited. Diasporic merchant communities work the same way. If you were a Sogdian merchant in Samarkand, you could send goods with your cousin in Chang'an and your uncle in Merv, confident they shared your values, language, and commitment to the community's collective reputation. The Sogdians, masters of the Silk Roads. The Sogdians, an Iranian-speaking people from the region of modern Uzbekistan, are arguably the most important diasporic merchant community of the early medieval period, roughly 500 to 1000 CE. Their home cities of Samarkand and Bukhara sat at the crossroads of the Silk Roads, and Sogdian merchants established colonies stretching from Byzantium in the west all the way to Tang Dynasty China in the east. Archaeological discoveries, including the famous Sogdian ancient letters found near Dunhuang, reveal merchants writing home about market conditions, debts, and family news. These letters are some of the most vivid primary sources you'll encounter on the AP exam, so if you see them referenced, know they come from Sogdian traders. The Sogdians didn't just carry goods, they carried Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, artistic styles, and technology across continents. This is the crucial AP exam concept. Diasporic merchants were vectors of cultural diffusion, not just economic exchange. They facilitated the spread of ideas, religions, and technologies alongside silk and spices. The Swahili bridging Africa and the Indian Ocean world. Along the East African coast, from roughly Mogadishu down to Mozambique, the Swahili emerged as one of history's most remarkable maritime trading cultures. The Swahili were not a diaspora in the sense of having fled a homeland. Instead, they developed as a hybrid culture, formed at the intersection of Bantu African traditions and Arab, Persian, and later Indian Muslim influences. The resulting Swahili language itself, still spoken by tens of millions today, is a Bantu language with enormous Arabic vocabulary, a living artifact of this exchange. Swahili city-states like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar grew fabulously wealthy by connecting the African interior, its gold, ivory, and enslaved people, with the Persian Gulf, India, and eventually China. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveler, visited Kilwa in the 1330s and called it one of the most beautiful cities in the world. When you see AP exam questions about the Indian Ocean Trade Network, the Swahili are your anchor for the African side of that equation. Jewish merchants. The Geniza traders. The Jewish merchant community provides one of the best documented examples of a diaspora enabling long-distance trade. The Cairo Geniza, a treasure trove of documents preserved in a Cairo synagogue, contains thousands of letters from Jewish merchants operating across the Mediterranean and into the Indian Ocean world during the 10th through 13th centuries. These Radhanite merchants, an earlier group, and later the Geniza traders leveraged their diaspora to move goods between Christian Europe, the Islamic world, and beyond, crossing political and religious boundaries that would have stopped most other travelers cold. Here's the AP exam insight you need to internalize. Jewish merchants could operate across the Christian-Islamic divide precisely because they belonged to neither world fully. Their shared religious law, halakha, provided a legal framework for contracts and dispute resolution that functioned independently of any single political authority. That's the power of a diasporic network. It creates its own institutional infrastructure. Overseas Chinese, connecting maritime Southeast Asia. From the Song dynasty onward and accelerating dramatically during the Ming and into the early modern period, Chinese merchants settled throughout Southeast Asia in port cities across what are now Vietnam, Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. The AP exam refers to these communities as overseas Chinese, and their role in maritime Southeast Asian trade is indispensable. They served as commercial intermediaries between local Southeast Asian producers and the vast Chinese market, and later between European colonial powers and Asian trading networks. In many port cities, overseas Chinese-controlled retail trade, banking, and tax farming, sometimes accumulating power that made colonial administrators both dependent on and nervous about them. APA exam traps and connections to watch for. Here are the mistakes that will cost you points. First, do not confuse diasporic merchant communities with the idea that these groups replaced local traders. They operated alongside them, often in symbiosis. Second, avoid describing these communities as purely economic actors. The AP exam consistently rewards responses that connect economic exchange to cultural and religious diffusion. Sogdians spreading Buddhism, Swahili merchants spreading Islam into the African interior, overseas Chinese spreading Chinese cultural practices. Third, remember that diasporic networks could function across hostile political borders. This is a feature, not a coincidence. The Mongol invasions disrupted overland Silk Road routes, but diasporic maritime networks in the Indian Ocean largely continued, which is why historians argue trade simply shifted rather than collapsed. For FRQ responses, the College Board rubric rewards specificity, naming Sogdians or Swahili as good, explaining how their diaspora structure enabled trust across distance earns the analysis point. Connecting them to cultural diffusion earns the complexity point. These communities connect backward to Unit 1's discussion of cross-cultural interaction and forward to Unit 4's examination of how European expansion eventually disrupted, and in some cases co-opted, these very same diasporic networks. With this foundation in place, let's turn to how the goods moving through these networks reflected and reinforced the environmental and agricultural conditions of the regions producing them. 2.9 Comparison of economic exchange from c. 1200 to c. 1450. All right, let's take a step back and do something really powerful. Compare all the major economic exchange systems we've been studying across this unit. Think of this section as the big picture episode of a documentary series, where the narrator zooms out and asks, what did all these trading networks actually have in common, and how were they fundamentally different? That comparison skill isn't just intellectually satisfying, It's exactly what the AP exam is testing you on, especially in the long essay question and document-based question where comparison is one of the core historical reasoning skills you'll need to demonstrate. The core framework. What are you actually comparing? The College Board wants you to be able to compare economic exchange across three major network types from this period: the Mongol-facilitated overland trade, the Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean Maritime Network, and the Trans-Saharan routes. Each had distinct goods, participants, methods of facilitating trust and credit, and social consequences. When the AP exam asks you to compare, it's never just listing differences. It wants you to identify a meaningful similarity or difference and explain why it matters historically. That's the key to earning those points on the rubric. Here's a useful mental framework. Imagine you're comparing three different farmers markets in your city. One is enormous and draws vendors from across the region. One is a specialized boutique market with rare goods, and one runs on strict word-of-mouth reputation. They're all markets. They all involve exchange, but the scale, the goods, the trust mechanisms, and the social effects are completely different. That's essentially what you're doing with these trading networks. Similarities across networks, the connective tissue. All three major networks shared some foundational characteristics, and recognizing these earns you the similarity point on the FRQ rubric. First, all three relied heavily on diaspora merchant communities, groups who settled permanently in foreign cities and served as cultural and commercial bridges. Jewish merchants operated across the Mediterranean and into the Indian Ocean. Arab merchants created permanent colonies in East African port cities like Kilwa. Chinese merchants settled throughout Southeast Asia. This pattern shows up everywhere because long-distance trade demanded trust, and trust was easiest to build within shared ethnic or religious communities. Second, all three networks spread more than just goods. They spread religion, language, and technology. Islam followed Arab merchants across the Indian Ocean and the Sahara with remarkable consistency. Buddhism had already traveled the Silk Road centuries earlier. This isn't a coincidence. When merchants settle in new places and build mosques or temples, local elites often convert because it signals access to those wealthy trading networks. The AP exam loves asking about the secondary effects of trade, and religion is the big one. Third, all networks developed sophisticated credit and trust instruments to solve the same core problem. How do you conduct business across thousands of miles without carrying enormous amounts of gold? The Islamic Hawala system, essentially a promise-to-pay network, functioned like an early wire transfer. The Commenda contract in Mediterranean trade allowed investors to fund merchants without traveling themselves. These instruments show up across multiple networks because the underlying economic problem, risk management over long distances, was universal. Key differences, where the networks diverge. Here's where the exam really tests your precision. The Indian Ocean Network stands apart from the Silk Roads in a critical way. It was far more accessible to a wider range of participants. The monsoon winds functioned as a free, reliable highway that any merchant with a dhow and knowledge of the seasonal winds could use. The Silk Roads, by contrast, required navigating political borders, paying tolls to various rulers, and surviving genuinely dangerous overland terrain. This helps explain why Indian Ocean trade volume was so enormous, and why you see such extraordinary cultural diversity in port cities like Calicut or Hormuz. The Trans-Saharan network differs from both in its dependence on a single, extraordinary technology, the camel. The domestication of the camel, specifically the dromedary adapted for desert conditions, made an otherwise impassable barrier into a viable trade corridor. Without it, West African gold and salt simply don't reach the Mediterranean world. A common MCQ trap is to treat the Trans-Saharan network as lesser than the others in importance. Don't fall for that. The gold flowing from Mali and Ghana was foundational to Mediterranean and even European economies. When you see questions about European access to gold in the medieval period, Trans-Saharan trade is the answer. The Mongol factor, a special comparison case. The College Board specifically wants you to understand how Mongol rule changed Silk Road exchange, making it a unique sub-comparison within this period. The Pax Mongolica, The relative peace enforced across the Mongol Empire from roughly 1,150 to 1,350 temporarily made overland Eurasian trade safer and faster than it had been in centuries. The YAM system of relay stations, essentially a pony express across Central Asia, allowed merchants and diplomats to move with extraordinary speed. This is why Marco Polo's journey was even possible. The exam will ask you to compare Silk Road trade before versus during the Mongol period. So be precise. Mongol rule increased volume and security, but also introduced the catastrophic variable of the Black Death traveling along those same routes. A grim reminder that networks carry bad things as efficiently as good ones. Common exam traps to avoid. The biggest wrong answer trap is assuming that more trade always meant more equality or benefit for all participants. The AP exam will test whether you understand that local artisans were often displaced by imported luxury goods, that enslaved people were one of the most consistently traded commodities across all three networks, and that political elites captured most of the tax revenue from trade while ordinary people saw limited direct benefit. When a question asks about the impact of trade, look for the answer that acknowledges complexity rather than pure prosperity. Another trap involves chronology, specifically conflating what was true in 1200 versus 1450. The Black Death arriving in the 4030 version for one Context your answers to the specific date range given. This comparative lens you've built here will carry you directly into Unit 3, where you'll watch these same networks transform under the pressures of European maritime expansion, and suddenly everything you've just compared will look very different. 2.9 Continuities and changes in trade network structures across this period. Let's take a moment and imagine you're standing in the middle of a busy airport. Gates everywhere, flights connecting dozens of cities, people transferring, cargo loading, routes shifting based on demand. Now imagine that airport has been running, in one form or another, for 1,000 years. Some routes stay the same because geography doesn't move. Others disappear when a civilization collapses. New ones appear when a merchant figures out a faster path. That airport is essentially what historians mean when they talk about trade network structures across the period 1200–1450 CE. The ERA College Board calls the networks of exchange unit. What trade network structures actually means. When the AP exam asks you about trade network structures, it's asking about more than just who traded with whom. It wants you to think about the architecture of exchange, the routes, the nodes, the goods, the facilitating technologies, the institutions, and crucially, what stayed the same versus what transformed. The College Board is especially interested in your ability to distinguish continuity from change and to explain the causes of each. That's your analytical frame for this entire topic. The major networks you need to know cold are the Silk Roads, overland and maritime, the Indian Ocean Trade Network, the Mediterranean Trade System, the Trans-Saharan routes, and, by the end of this period, the beginning of robust interregional connections in the Americas and sub-Saharan Africa. Think of each network as a separate circulatory system in a larger global body. They sometimes connect, they sometimes operate independently. They all respond to the same pressures of supply, demand, political stability, and technology. What stayed the same? The continuities. Here's a truth the AP exam loves to test. Geography is stubbornly persistent. The Indian Ocean Trade Network, for example, had been functioning for centuries before 1200 CE, and it kept functioning well into the 1450s and beyond because the monsoon winds didn't change. Merchants had figured out long ago that if you sail southwest in summer and northeast in winter, the Indian Ocean practically carries you for free. That knowledge and the infrastructure built around it, The port cities of Calicut, Hormuz, Malacca, Kilwa, these were continuities. They were the bones of the network that didn't shift even as the flesh around them changed. Similarly, the goods flowing along the Silk Roads showed significant continuity. Luxury goods, silk, spices, precious metals, glassware, and porcelain remained the backbone of long-distance overland trade throughout this period. The logic of long-distance trade, high-value, low-weight goods that justify the enormous cost and risk of transport, is itself a continuity that predates 1200 and outlasts 1450. When you see an MCQ asking what types of goods dominated Silk Road exchange, the answer is always luxury goods, not bulk staples like grain. That's a critical distinction. Another major continuity is the role of diasporic merchant communities. Whether it's Arab merchants operating across the Indian Ocean world, Jewish merchants in the Mediterranean, or Chinese merchants throughout Southeast Asia, these communities served as the connective tissue of trade. They maintained trust through shared language, religious law, and family networks, and this pattern held steady across the entire period. On the FRQ, if you're making a continuity argument, diasporic merchant networks are one of your strongest pieces of evidence. What changed and why? Now, here's where it gets exciting. The most dramatic change in trade network structures during this period is the rise and fall and rise of the Mongol Empire's impact on the Silk Roads. Think of the Mongols as a construction crew that temporarily built a superhighway across Eurasia under the Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace of the 13th and early 14th centuries. The overland Silk Roads experienced a dramatic surge. Safe passage across Central Asia was, relatively speaking, guaranteed. This is what allowed figures like Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta to travel extraordinary distances. Trade volume increased, diplomatic contacts multiplied, and crucially, diseases traveled too, which brings us to the Black Death. The bubonic plague, spreading along Mongol-facilitated trade routes in the mid-14th century, is one of the most important agents of change in this entire unit. It devastated populations from China to Europe, disrupted overland routes, weakened the Mongol states that had guaranteed safe passage. And here's the connection College Board loves: pushed European merchants to eventually look for alternative maritime routes to Asia. That's your bridge to Unit 4, the Age of Exploration. Understanding the plague's disruption of Silk Road commerce helps explain why Portuguese sailors were hugging the African coast a century later. Meanwhile, the Indian Ocean network was actually growing during this period, partly because overland routes became less reliable. The expansion of Islam across North Africa, East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and into South and Southeast Asia created a vast web of shared commercial law, shared language, Arabic as a lingua franca, and shared religious infrastructure. Mosques, caravanserais, and funduks, merchant lodging houses, weren't just spiritual or social spaces, they were commercial infrastructure. When you see a document about a merchant in Kilwa or Calicut, recognize that Islam's spread was a structural change that facilitated trade network expansion, not just a religious or cultural development. Common MCQ traps and FRQ pitfalls. The exam will try to trick you in a few predictable ways. First, watch out for questions that imply the Silk Roads were purely Chinese. They weren't. They were multinodal with contributions from Persians, Sogdians, Arabs, and Turks at different points. The Sogdians in particular were the dominant middlemen for centuries before this period even begins. Second, don't confuse the Maritime Silk Road with the Indian Ocean network. They overlap significantly, but College Board sometimes distinguishes them. The Maritime Silk Road typically refers to the coastal routes connecting China through Southeast Asia to the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean network is broader. For the FRQ, remember that continuity arguments are just as important as change arguments. Students consistently undersupport continuity. If you're writing a long essay or document-based question response, you need to show why something persisted. The monsoon winds continued to drive Indian Ocean trade because seasonal wind patterns remained unchanged is a far stronger statement than simply asserting continuity without causation. Causation is the difference between a 3 and a 5. Also remember that these trade networks weren't just about economics. They transmitted religions, technologies, crops, and diseases. When the exam asks about the effects of trade network expansion, think beyond commerce to cultural diffusion, demographic change, and technological transfer. Connecting to other units. This topic threads through nearly every unit in the course. The diasporic merchant communities you meet here show up again in Unit 4 with European expansion. The plague you study here reshapes European society in ways that feed directly into Unit 3's discussion of cultural and intellectual change. The Indian Ocean network you analyze here becomes the target of Portuguese intervention in Unit 4. Understanding the structure of these networks now gives you the scaffolding to explain why their disruption mattered so enormously later. With that foundation in place, let's turn to the specific goods, technologies, and peoples that made these networks function, because knowing what moved through the networks is just as important as knowing how the networks were built. 2.9b Historical Thinking Skills. Continuity and Change Over Time, CCOT, and Comparison Across Regions. Let's talk about two of the most powerful tools in your AP World History Toolkit, tools that the College Board will test you on again and again, not just in Unit 2, but across every single unit of this course. Think of continuity and change over time, or CCOT, and comparison as the two lenses on a pair of historical binoculars. One lens lets you look through time, asking what changed and what stayed the same across a period. The other lets you look across space, asking how two different societies, regions, or civilizations were similar or different at roughly the same moment. Together, they give you a complete picture of the past, and together they are absolutely essential for scoring a 5. Understanding CCOT. The river and the banks. Here's the analogy I want you to hold on to. Think of history as a river, the water flowing through, that's change. The riverbanks holding that water in place, that's continuity. The College Board wants you to recognize that history is always doing both at once. Something is always shifting, and something is always staying put. When you apply CCOT to the networks of exchange in Unit 2, the Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean Trade Network, the Trans-Saharan routes, the Mongol Empire, you need to resist the temptation to say simply, trade grew or things changed. That's a trap. The AP exam rewards precision. You need to identify what specifically changed, when the turning point occurred, what caused that shift, and this is the part students most often forget, what remained the same even as other things transformed. Take the Indian Ocean Trade Network as your example. From roughly 1200 to 1450, the volume of trade expanded dramatically, facilitated by the adoption of the dhow and the expert use of monsoon winds. That's change. But here's the continuity. The fundamental merchant diasporas, Arab, Indian, and Swahili traders operating out of coastal port cities, remained central to organizing that commerce across the entire period. The players changed somewhat, the underlying logic of how trade was organized did not. If an MCQ asks you what best represents continuity in Indian Ocean trade during this period, you lock in on the role of merchant communities and seasonal wind patterns. Do not get distracted by descriptions of new goods or new empires entering the picture. Those are the change side of the ledger. The single most common MCQ trap around CCOT is what I call the all or nothing mistake. A wrong answer choice will often describe something as completely transformed or entirely unchanged when the historical reality is always more nuanced. Real history almost never works in absolutes. When you see answer choices on your exam, be suspicious of words like eliminated, replaced entirely, or remained exactly the same. History is messy and layered, and the College Board knows that, so the right answer usually captures that complexity. How to structure CCOT for the FRQ. If you're writing a long essay question or a document-based question with a CCOT argument, the College Board's rubric is looking for 3 things: a historically defensible thesis that establishes both change and continuity, evidence that supports your argument with specific historical examples, and reasoning that explains why things changed or stayed the same. What historians call causation and context. Simply listing changes without explaining why they happened will cost you points. Think of it this way. You're not just a reporter describing events. You're a detective explaining the forces that drove them. A strong CCOT thesis sounds something like this. While the expansion of Mongol rule across Central Asia in the 13th and 14th centuries fundamentally transformed the security and volume of Silk Road trade, the basic commercial infrastructure of oasis cities and caravanserai culture that had organized overland exchange since antiquity remained largely intact. Notice what that sentence does. It acknowledges change, acknowledges continuity, and implicitly signals causation by connecting both to specific historical forces. Comparison across regions, the side-by-side method. Now, let's flip to that second lens. Comparison asks you to place two societies, regions, or trade networks side by side and analyze both their similarities and their differences. In Unit 2, the most frequently tested comparison is between the major exchange networks themselves, Silk Roads versus Indian Ocean, or Trans-Saharan trade versus Indian Ocean trade. The College Board loves this because comparison forces you to think structurally, not just factually. Here's a concrete example. Both the Silk Roads and the Trans-Saharan routes facilitated the spread of Islam and connected distant civilizations through long-distance commerce. That's a genuine similarity, and it's testable. But here's the key difference. The exam loves to probe. The Silk Roads primarily moved luxury goods like silk and spices overland through a relay system of middlemen, while the Trans-Saharan routes were characterized by the movement of gold and salt, bulk commodities, and were dominated to a striking degree by a single cultural intermediary, the Berber-speaking peoples of North Africa. If you blur those distinctions together, you'll fall into the comparison trap of overgeneralizing. The College Board specifically tests whether you can identify meaningful similarities and differences, not surface-level ones, saying, both networks involved merchants is technically true, but earns you nothing. Saying both networks facilitated the spread of world religions because merchants carried cultural practices alongside commercial goods, that's a meaningful analytical comparison that scores points. Connecting CCOT and comparison to the whole course. These skills are not confined to Unit 2. Every single unit of AP World History asks you to apply CCOT and comparison. In Unit 3, you'll use CCOT to trace how gunpowder empires transformed political authority over time, while preserving certain imperial traditions. In Unit 4, you'll compare the motivations and methods of European maritime empires. In Unit 6, you'll analyze how industrialization changed and yet also reinforced existing global economic hierarchies. The reason the College Board embeds these skills in Unit 2 is because the Silk Roads era gives you a rich, well-documented set of examples to practice on. But make no mistake, you're building habits of historical thinking that you'll need through Unit 9. One final distinction to keep crisp in your mind. CCOT is always temporal. It tracks change across time within a theme or region. Comparison is always spatial or categorical. It places two things side by side. Students mix these up on the exam and end up writing comparison essays that accidentally become narrative timelines. If a prompt asks you to compare, your essay should be organized around points of similarity and difference, not chronological events. Lock that in. With those two lenses firmly in hand, the river of change and the side-by-side of comparison, you're ready to move forward into examining how the specific commodities and ideas flowing through these networks left lasting marks on the societies they touched. 2.9c Document-based and long essay question strategies for networks of exchange themes. Let's talk strategy. You've spent weeks absorbing the facts: the Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean trade networks, the Trans-Saharan caravans, the spread of Buddhism and Islam along those routes. Now comes the part that actually determines your score, turning everything you know into a well-constructed argument on exam day. Think of this section as your game plan. A football team that knows all the plays but has no strategy for the fourth quarter is going to lose. You're not going to lose. Understanding what the DBQ is really asking. The document-based question in the context of networks of exchange is almost always asking you to evaluate change in continuity or cause and effect along trade routes. Maybe it's asking why Indian Ocean trade expanded after 1000 CE, or how the Mongol Empire affected cross-regional exchange. Before you write a single word of your essay, you need to pause and identify the historical thinking skill embedded in the prompt. College Board loves to hide the real question inside what looks like a simple discuss prompt. Train yourself to ask, is this a causation question? A continuity and change over time question? A comparison question? Getting this right is the difference between a 3 and a 5. Once you've identified that skill, your thesis needs to do real intellectual work. The single most common trap on the DBQ, and I've watched thousands of students fall into it, is writing a thesis that simply restates the prompt. Indian Ocean trade changed over time in many ways is not a thesis. It's a weather forecast without a prediction. A scorable thesis makes a historically defensible claim that establishes a line of reasoning. Try something like, although Indian Ocean commerce maintained consistent reliance on monsoon wind patterns, the period between 1200 and 1450 CE saw significant transformations in the diversity of goods exchanged and the cultural identities of dominant merchants, driven primarily by the rise of Islamic trading networks. That sentence earns a point. It has a claim, it has nuance, and it sets up your argument. Working the documents like a pro. Here's where networks of exchange themes get genuinely interesting on the DBQ. You will almost certainly see documents from a Chinese bureaucrat, an Arab geographer, an African ruler or merchant, a European traveler, and maybe a religious text. Your job is not to summarize what they say. Your job is to use them as evidence for your argument. Think of each document as a witness in a courtroom. You're the attorney. You call witnesses to prove your case, not just to let them talk. For sourcing, which earns you a crucial point, you need to analyze the author's historical situation, audience, purpose, or point of view, and explain how that context affects the document's meaning or reliability. Don't just say Ibn Battuta was a traveler, so he saw trade firsthand. That's a C- observation. Instead, say, because Ibn Battuta was a Muslim scholar writing for a Moroccan royal audience, his account emphasizes the cosmopolitan Islamic character of Indian Ocean port cities, likely amplifying the wealth and piety of Muslim merchants to validate the cultural reach of his own civilization. That is sourcing. That earns the point. The complexity point trips up more students than almost anything else. For networks of exchange essays, complexity usually means one of 4 things: corroborating across documents using outside evidence, explaining both causes and effects, comparing the trade network to another network from a different region, or explaining a tension or contradiction within your evidence. A clean way to earn complexity is to compare the Indian Ocean network to the Silk Road. Acknowledge that both facilitated cultural diffusion, but argue that the Indian Ocean network created more durable commercial communities because merchants physically settled in port cities rather than passing goods through intermediaries. Crafting your long essay on exchange networks. The long essay question gives you 3 choices, and you should almost always pick the one where you can generate the most specific evidence, not the one that sounds easiest. For networks of exchange, the LEQ prompts typically center on what drove the expansion of trade, geography, technology demand, political stability, what spread along trade routes, religion, disease, crops, ideas, or how different empires facilitated or disrupted exchange. Your LEQ needs exactly the same quality thesis as the DBQ, but now all your evidence comes from your own knowledge. This is where your Unit 2 content mastery becomes your ammunition. Build your body paragraphs around categories of evidence rather than chronological storytelling. Don't tell the story of the Silk Road from beginning to end. Argue that technological innovations, specifically the caravanserai system and the magnetic compass, were the primary drivers of expansion, then prove it with multiple pieces of evidence. A common wrong answer trap in both the LEQ and DBQ is treating trade networks as purely economic phenomena. College Board's rubric rewards students who understand that networks of exchange were simultaneously economic, cultural, religious, and epidemiological systems. The Black Death traveled the Mongol trade routes. Buddhism spread through merchant patronage. Swahili culture emerged from the fusion of Bantu and Arab traditions in Indian Ocean port cities. When you weave together these dimensions, your essay demonstrates the kind of sophisticated historical thinking that separates 4S from 5S. Connections across units you cannot ignore. Networks of exchange doesn't live in a bubble. In Unit 3, you'll see how the collapse of Mongol protected trade routes in the mid-1300s, combined with the devastation of the Black Death, set the stage for the dramatic maritime expansion of the Portuguese and Spanish in Unit 4. On the exam, a strong student makes that bridge explicitly. In Units 1 and 2 together, the story of how the Abbasid Caliphate positioned Baghdad as a nexus of the Silk Road connects directly to why Islamic scholarship and commercial practices spread so effectively. When your essay makes those inter-unit connections, you're demonstrating the kind of analytical depth that earns the complexity point and signals to the reader that you understand history as a web, not a list of facts. One final thing to keep in your toolkit. Always name drop a specific historian's interpretive lens or a concrete, named piece of evidence when you can. Ibn Battuta, Zheng He's voyages, the Tao as a technological innovation, the role of Malacca as an entrepot. Specificity is credibility. Vague claims get partial credit at best. With your DBQ and LEQ strategies, now locked in for networks of exchange, let's move forward into how you can apply these same skills as we zoom out to examine the broader patterns of state building and empire that will dominate Unit 3.